Grace Garage.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Automotive Aerodynamics with me, Gray. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite cars, one of the older cars that I like. This is the Jaguar E-Type. In my opinion, and in many people's opinion, one of the most beautiful cars ever made. So this car was produced from 1961 to 1975, and it had three different series. So there's a series 1, 2, and 3. And each series had the distinct E-type figure, but there were some small physical changes, and that helps you identify which series a particular car is if you see it on the road. So we're going to talk about a little bit about these differences and how they impacted the aerodynamics in particular. So the three types, again, we have the series 1, 2, and 3, but there's also three different types of car that was produced. There was the two-seater open top, which had a soft top as well as a hard top, a glass fiber hard top you could put on. Then there was the two-seater coupe, which is the one most people know. This is the hard top coupe. And then there was introduced later on a 2+2, which is a four-seater coupe, and this is also a hard top. So we're going to talk about physical differences between the three models and how that impacts the aerodynamics. So the purpose here of this episode is, again, to talk about this car and look at the aerodynamics, and we're really going to focus on how do those different features impact the aero and the differences between the open top and the closed top, the hard top, sorry. So I have done some experiments, and I have here a 1/18 scale model. It's a die-cast model, so it's quite heavy. It's painted black here for the experiments, but it did look much nicer. I can show you a picture here before I painted it. So it was a nice high-quality reproduction. And as you maybe can tell here, I had to improvise the closed-top coupe. This model came as an open-top two-seater, so one of those distinct styles. And to look at the closed top, the hard top coupe, I had to fashion my own hard top. So I looked at some pictures online, and to the best of my ability, I have tried to fashion this hard top using some plastic and some modeling clay. So it's not perfect. It's not going to be the perfect line compared to the actual vehicle, but I've done my best, and we're going to see here the differences between that open top and the hard top. So let's jump right in and talk about some of the features, the differences between the different types of cars that were produced. Most of this data is coming from this book right here. This is called Jaguar E-Type Ultimate Portfolio. And it's one of those Ultimate Portfolio series. There's tons on different cars. It's a good book. It's mostly a collection of articles. And because this is quite an old car, they're mostly black and white. Not too much information on the aerodynamics of this car in this book, and that's because the car is so old. Back then, aerodynamics was still sort of a new age thing, didn't get done too much. Although apparently they did do some wind tunnel tests on the E-Type. But we're going to talk about why this car, although it looks very sleek and smooth and sexy, is not the most aerodynamic. So let's jump right in and talk about this car. First off, we're going to talk about the Series 1, and we're going to talk about the differences between the open top and hard top. But first off, let's talk about one of the most distinct features of the E-Type, and that is the highly angled windscreen. The Series 1 vehicles all had a windscreen rake of 46.5 degrees. Now that's 46.5 degrees from the vertical. And this resulted in some interesting aerodynamics, which we're going to talk about. But we're going to look at that later with the experiments. Moving on, this car had a top speed of 150 miles per hour, and there was some noticeable difference between the hard top and the open top. During a coasting test, whereas you go up to speed and then you cut the engine and coast, and you see how long you can coast for, the closed top, the hard top, was able to coast further, which means it had less resistance, less drag. And this makes sense, and this is going to make even more sense when we look at the experimental results that I have. Some drivers here that were testing this car noticed that above about 80 miles per hour, there was significant wind buffeting in the convertible open top. And that's just because of this particular design. We're going to see why wind buffeting was such a huge issue for the open top E-type. Also, you can do some tests at home where you look at, if it's raining, how the rain moves along the car. And some authors found that the rain moved quite smoothly along the long bonnet. And so we're going to look at that as well. And it's also been noted that although the front windscreen had 3 wipers on the Series 1, the rear windscreen on the back of the hardtop coupe had no wiper. So it didn't actually need a wiper, and that's because the airflow kept it clear of rain and dirt. And we're going to see why that happens for the two-door coupe. So that's the Series 1, and now that's just the regular Series 1 open top and hardtop, and now we're going to talk about a different car that was introduced a little bit later, and that's the 2+2. All right, so now we're talking about the Series 1 2+2, which is the 4-seater hardtop coupe. The angle of the windscreen was the same, it's still 46.5 degrees. However, the car was stretched. It was stretched by 9 inches, and so the roof slope was a little bit different, and the top speed was observed to be only 136.2 miles per hour, so about a 10% reduction over the two-door coupe, or the 2-seater coupe. And so some of the ideas on why this reduction happened, it had a larger frontal area. They had to raise the roof to have that 4-seater occupancy. And there was a more abrupt roof slope. So the back of the vehicle had a different slope because there's now 4 people sitting inside of it, and it's stretched 9 inches. And so we're going to, talk about that a little bit more later and think about the different types of aerodynamics that are happening when you have the 2+2 versus just the 2-seater. It was also noted that the 2+2 had more effect with side winds, so when the wind is hitting the car from the side, and that's just mostly due to the fact that there's a larger surface area on the 2+2, and that's because the car is being stretched. One thing that we haven't really talked about yet is the headlights, and these are going to be changing drastically over the Series 1, Series 2, and Series 3. And for the Series 1, they had a faired headlight, so that's a headlight that's enclosed in some plastic. I'm not sure if it was plastic or glass, but apparently, this is good for aerodynamics, but apparently it was very bad at cutting down the actual light output. So you couldn't drive faster than about 90 miles per hour at night because you couldn't actually see that far with the headlights. So if you're driving faster than 90 miles per hour, you're not going to see you're not going to have enough time to react when you see something on the road. One interesting thing, I was talking about the different roof slopes with the 2+2 and the 2-seater. One author noticed that they took some of the lights to back out, so there's openings in the body shell when they're driving, and they noticed that exhaust fumes are being sucked back into the back seat of the 2+2. And that indicates that there's some recirculation back here where it's just pulling those exhaust fumes from the tailpipes into the back seats. And he also noted that the 2+2 gets bluing of the rear bumper, the chrome rear bumper, and that doesn't happen on the 2-seater coupe. So there's some different aerodynamics here happening in the back, and we're going to talk about that and maybe draw some sketches and see what's going on. But it's interesting to note that just by reading some authors' accounts, you can get an idea of what's going on here at the back of the E-type. So let's finish up now talking about the Series 2 and Series 3. So for the Series 2, the 2+2 E-type had a different windscreen rake angle. It was actually raked less sharply. So it was moved from 46.5 to 53.5 degrees from the vertical. So it's a little bit shallower. And this brought the car into a little bit better proportion because it has such a large hood or bonnet compared to the rest of the vehicle that this change in windscreen angle just seemed to give it a little bit better appearance in some people's opinions. One thing that's very interesting, we talked about the headlight fairings. Due to US regulations, they wanted to bring the car to the US, they didn't allow these headlight fairings because it cut down on light output. So they had to remove those light fairings, and they actually had to move the lights forward so that the headlights actually stuck out of the bodywork. I have a picture here showing that. And that may be good for light output and regulations, but it's terrible for aerodynamics. And I've already made a video on headlight drag, the pop-up headlight drag. And these aren't really pop-up headlights, but it's a similar idea. So you can take a look at that video here and learn about headlight drag. Last thing here, the 3 Series, moving on from the 2 to the 3 Series, had a larger frontal grille. It actually had a grille at the front, and it had an air scoop down below for some cooling, and I believe it had a larger bumper, and some of them even had these weird rubber bumper things at the front, and you couldn't even open the hood properly. In my opinion, the most ugly Series was the Series 3, and the Series 2, Series 1 was the most beautiful in my opinion. So that's all I have to say here from this book on the aerodynamics. Not too much. I went through the whole book and just pulled out what was interesting. Now let's go ahead and jump into some experimental results and take a look at why you want the 2-door hardtop instead of the open top for drag reasons. Let's go ahead and do that. First off, let's take a look at the open top coupe. And here we have the hydrogen bubble visualization technique. Now, I've already explained this before in the first episode, so if you want to understand how this visualization technique works, click this link here to watch the starting of the first episode. So what we're seeing here are hydrogen bubble gas in a water channel moving over the open top E-type coupe. And the flow is from the left to the right, and we're looking at the flow from the side. So we have a side view of the airflow around the open top coupe. So what we can see here is that the flow moves smoothly along the bonnet. We do have some turbulence near the front of the windshield, but the main turbulence and mixing here is just aft of the windshield. And this is due to the open top design. So this is going to contribute to the buffeting that the passengers feel. Now this is only at low speed, so you can actually see the movement of the bubbles quite clearly. But to get a more accurate representation of what's going on, we need to move to high speed flow. So let's go ahead and do that now and then talk about the results. We are now looking at the same situation, however now we have high speed flow. So those hydrogen bubbles are being produced on the left and they're flowing to the right, and they're showing us the pattern around the open top E-type coupe. So we can see here, moves very smoothly along the front bonnets over top of the windshield, and there it separates the top of the windshield and forms a large recirculation turbulent wake. So aft of the windshield, the flow is completely turbulent, completely mixing, and very dirty. And so we can see that we saw this before at the low speed, and we see it again at the high speed. And this is mainly due to the open top design. We also notice that the windows are down, but this sharp angle of the windshield is really causing this large recirculation region. That's what's really causing this, because the flow cannot make this sharp turn, and it doesn't want to reattach to the car downstream of the passengers. So let's now turn on some bubbles that are being produced inside the cockpit to see how the flow around the passengers looks like. Here again we have high speed flow, however now we have bubbles being produced upstream from a wire, as well as bubbles being produced from a wire inside the cockpit. And what we can see here is that the bubbles being produced upstream, they move smoothly around the car and they are of a high speed nature. And they look very different from the bubbles being produced inside the cockpit. And this is because the bubbles inside the cockpit are actually slower moving. And this is due to the recirculation separated wake region, which is caused by the open top design and the sharp windshield angle. So what we can see here is that inside the cabin there is a low speed flow. It's very turbulent, it's very mixing. You can see that the paths of the bubbles are very erratic. The flow actually is moving backwards, so it's actually moving forwards with the car, and this is consistent with a separated wake. You can see that downstream of the passengers along the back trunk, the flow sometimes reattaches, sometimes it doesn't. It's very unsteady, it's changing dynamically with time, and this is what really causes that wind buffeting at high speeds. So the passengers are being buffeted from all sides, the flow is constantly changing direction, and this is what really causes driver fatigue with this open top design. So let's now turn off the bubbles that are being produced upstream and get a closer look at just the flow around the drivers. You know what, before we do that, let's just zoom in here while we have both bubble sources on and take a closer look here. So you can really see that the high speed flow moving around the vehicle is of a totally different nature than the low speed flow inside the cabin. And that's because the flow moving around the vehicle is high speed, it's non-separated, whereas inside the cabin it's a fully separated wake, it's turbulent. You can see how the bubbles are constantly mixing and turbulent and changing direction, and there's a very distinct forward movement of the bubbles in this region, so that the driver's hair would actually be pushed forwards, even though you would think that the driver's hair would be pushed backwards because they're driving straight along the road. So this is quite interesting, and now let's turn off the upstream bubbles when we're zoomed in here and take a closer look. Alright, so here we go. We've turned off the bubbles that are coming from upstream, and we only have the bubbles being produced in that low speed wake inside the cabin. And you can really see here the different types of movement of the bubbles. So we can see mixing, sort of a recirculation, and this is a swirling motion of the bubbles. We can also see that movement forwards, which would push the driver's hair forward. But it's very unsteady, which means that it's changing very rapidly in time. And again, this is what really causes that driver fatigue. It really causes the annoyance. And this is one of the features here of this E-type Jag. So we're going to see now what the difference is when we close the top and we have the two-seater coupe with the hardtop, how the flow moves around this region, even with this very sharp windshield angle. So here we have the two-seater hardtop coupe, and again I fashioned this hardtop using some plastic and clay, so I did my best, but I don't guarantee that the silhouette is exactly right. But here we have a low speed flow, and what we can see here is that the flow moves smoothly along the bonnet. Again, because it's low speed, we do have some unsteadiness at the base of the windshield. But here we see that at the top of the windshield, in contrast to the open top, the flow is able to make that corner and then move smoothly downstream along the hardtop outline. Now you might say, is that really smoothly? Well, we'll take a closer look when it's at high speed, which is more realistic of the actual car on the highway. But you can agree that it's much nicer than the open top. And if we look at the back, we can see that the flow separates near the rear bumper, and we get some recirculation at the base of the vehicle where the exhaust pipes are. So let's now move to high speed. Actually, you know what, before we do that, let's turn on some interval bubbles. This is bubbles that are being pulsed, and we can get a look here at how the bubbles move around the Jag. We now have the same situation as before. We have a low speed flow, however now we have a pulsed bubble sheet. And so what this does is it allows us to follow the bubbles as they move around the outline of the vehicle and just see how the flow develops. And again, these bubbles are representing the air as it moves around the E-type Jag. So what we can see is that we do have that unsteadiness at the base of the windshield, and this is very common for a low rake angle windshield. That's a very vertical windshield. And the one key thing here to look at is the sharp angle at the top of the windshield where that airflow needs to make that turn. This is what's going to be causing a lot of the drag on this vehicle. Now I'm going to be making a video later on rake angles of windshields and how that affects your drag. And typically older vehicles have lower rake angles, which means they have more vertical windshields. And this is one of the major sources of drag on these vehicles. So even though this E-type Jag looks very streamlined and beautiful, because it has this low rake angle windshield, this very vertical windshield, a lot of drag is being produced right here. And that's because this flow needs to make this corner, and that causes a high pressure region at the front of your windshield. You know, ever wonder why you have the air inlets at the base of your windshield? That's because that's a high pressure region, and that actually helps force air into your ventilation system. And this is on all cars. We're now going to move to high speed flow for the hardtop coupe. Here we have the high speed flow around the hardtop coupe. And as before, we can see that the flow moves smoothly around the windshield. It's able to make that corner, and again, it's due to this that causes the high pressure region. You can really see that curvature in the streamline closest to the vehicle. The higher this curvature, the higher the pressure at the windshield will be, and this high pressure is pushing back on the vehicle, causing a large drag. And this is one of the reasons why this car has a high coefficient of drag. I've found some resources that say somewhere between 0.4 and 0.44. Now, relating this to the Toyota Prius of today, which has a coefficient of drag of 0.26, the E-type Jag isn't that great. And one of the main reasons here is because of that windshield. We can see that different than the open top, the flow is very smooth along the back, and we have a very small separation bubble at the back. Let's now focus in on the back. Here we're zoomed into the back portion of the flow for the hardtop coupe. And as before, we can see how those streamlines are moving smoothly along the back surface. Near the rear bumper, the flow can't follow the lines of the vehicle anymore, and we do get separation with some recirculation at the back near the exhaust outlet. And here we can make that comparison between the two-seater hardtop coupe and the 2+2. Now, we were mentioning before that because you change this outline, this curvature, that it may cause a different drag, and that's because that the 2+2 may cause flow separation further upstream, and this would cause a higher drag, and that's just due to the shape of the vehicle. And if that happened, we would have a larger recirculation at the back of the vehicle. Remember I told you that story about that editor who had exhaust coming into the back of the vehicle, and that may, and also bluing of the rear bumper, that may be caused by that larger recirculation region due to earlier separation on the 2+2 because it has a different profile. Another thing I mentioned at the start of this video is that one of the editors of one of those articles mentioned that the flow moves very smoothly along the front bonnet when he looked at the rain pattern. So let's take a look here now at the front of the vehicle, and you can see that that bumper protruding does interfere with the flow a little bit. Our stagnation point appears to be at the center of that bumper, and this is low speed flow, so the flow doesn't actually reach the surface of the vehicle. We're going to move to high speed flow here in a second and see how it differs. But the flow seems to move very smoothly along the front bonnet and then be deflected around that low rake angle windshield. So let's now look at the high speed flow and compare it to this low speed. Here we have high speed flow at the front of the two-seater hardtop, and it looks very similar to the low speed flow that we saw previously. But let's talk a little bit about the stagnation point, which looks to be here at about the middle of that bumper. Now this is fairly high, and this is one of the reasons that this car experiences front end lift at higher speeds and also has a higher drag coefficient. Modern vehicles have moved the stagnation point down towards the ground, and this reduces your front end lift, it reduces your drag, and so you can really see here for this older vehicle, this higher stagnation point really causes a large difference. So that's one thing to note here. Along with the windshield, this high stagnation point is why the E-Type has a higher drag, even though it looks so streamlined. In conclusion, we took a look at one of my favorite old cars and one of the most beautiful cars in history, the Jaguar E-Type. And we looked at the Series 1, the Series 2, then the Series 3. We talked about the different physical features of each one and how that may impact the aerodynamics. We looked at the open top, the two-seater hardtop, and the 2+2 and talked about some of those differences. And we also looked at some experimental results. So the conclusion here is, if you really want an open top, that's great, but you're going to suffer a ton of wind buffeting. You're going to suffer a lower drag than the hardtop. But I guess, if that's up your alley, if you want to just cruise around, great. So my wireless mic died on me right here, and I apologize, but I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and like my videos. This really shows me that you enjoy it, and I will continue to make more. I do this on my free time, so I apologize that I haven't made one for a long time, but stay tuned. The next car here is going to be a Nissan GTR.
Graysgarage.